Thanks very much for that great welcome, and I'm sorry I haven't got my guitar here to entertain you this morning. It would have been fun. And I'd really like to thank Gary and all the team from AACE for inviting me here today. It was a great honour to be able to speak at Ed Media and to be back at eLearn after a number of years. So what I want to do this morning is hopefully challenge you a little bit, and also to present some ideas that I've been working on for a manuscript. And I think e-learning is a very interesting field, and I'm going to start by presenting a short e-learning journey just to set a context. And for me, that e-learning journey began with large mainframe computers. It moved through multimedia, it came into online, and I'm not sure where it's going now, but it's somewhere out there on the web. And one of the interesting things is that having been there, I won't say quite in the beginning, I think Tom Reeves may have been there in the beginning, but is that in those early days it was like we had the Force with us, because computers were going to change the world, they were going to change education, they were going to change how we teach and how we learn. And it seems to me that in fact what has happened more recently is that we have the dark side. And there are lots of things happening that you may not be aware of, or you may think are just normal, but for me they are real challenges to us as educators, as us as teachers, and us as learners. And so what I want to do is take a little journey and a trip through that to try and make some sense out of these observations. So we're going to have a little battle, the e-learning wars, the Force and the dark side. And I guess it will be interesting to see who you identify with. Are there any Darth Vaders out there? Of course not. You're all Luke Skywalkers or Leia, because they were twins. So what I want to do is go through this, and I've put up this image, A, because I think it's a fantastic image, but essentially the combatants in this battle in the e-learning wars, very surprisingly, are the two things: the learning bit, or the pedagogy, and the E bit, the technology. That's our problem. They're the two combatants that we have, and they're the two areas that I'm going to look at in various ways this morning. And the way that I'm going to do that is take another little journey, and I'm going to start off by providing some definitions of some of those terms that we're working with. I'm going to move along and have a look at the technology and make some observations about the technology we use for teaching and learning, the e-learning technology. I'm going to move along and raise what I've called some sacred cows. They're things that we think are so important and so valuable that we must follow them. And yet, if we think about them a little bit more carefully, you'll find that in fact they may well be more representatives of the dark side than the Force, from a certain perspective. And my perspective, just so you know, and I will say it again, is as a designer. And I want to talk about design. I want to talk about the design challenges that we face. And finally, I'm going to reintroduce a model that I've just developed and publishing, which is called design alchemy. So that's a little journey that we're going to take. So what I want to do is start off with some definitions so that you have a sense of what I'm talking about. And those definitions start off with the word pedagogy. And I know that traditionally, in the US at least, pedagogy is often to do with teaching and learning. But I want to use a sort of modern version and a modern take on that from Beetham and Sharp's 2013, that's 2013, not 2103, but it could well be, is the essential dialogue between teaching and learning. So pedagogy is about teaching and learning. The second definition out of our friend Wikipedia is technology. And it's about making, so it's not about computers, it's about making, modifying, using knowledge of tools, machines, techniques, craft systems, and methods of organisation in order to solve a problem. So technology should be solving a problem, not creating a problem. And last but not least is design. And design is two things. Design is a verb, which means to create or fashion or execute or construct according to a plan. But it's also a noun, so the way parts of something are formed and arranged for a particular use. So I can design something, and as a result, I create a design. So I will be using those two terms interchangeably when they come up. So that, just by way of background, there's some definitions. And if you're like me at a presentation, you'll say, oh wow, he's already gone through one of those little buttons. So there's only a few more to go. But I want to talk, the next one is about technology. And it's very interesting. For those of you that know me, I've been working with computers and learning since 1979, and I met my first computer in 1971. So you can date me if you like and work out how old I am. And so technology's been my life, but it's only been in the last year that I've determined that technology is no longer important. So I'll explain a little bit about that. So that's my take. As e-learning developers and designers, we no longer have to worry about technology. A little bit about technology is that one way that it's been described is that technology provides an innovation. And based on, you might have, I'm sure many of you have seen the Gartner hype cycle, is that it looks a bit like this, that we have a technology trigger and some new technology comes out. For example, the MOOC. And then we have a peak of inflated expectations, we go through a trough of disillusionment, we have a slope of enlightenment and a plateau of productivity, and the technology usually keeps on going. One of the things that it seems to me over the years is that when we transfer this to educational technology, we get a different slope. And we do get enlightenment, and we do get productivity, but then it goes, and we end up with what I call a slope of forgetfulness. All the things that we learned about using technology for education somehow disappear into this huge pit of knowledge. And unfortunately, what seems to me to happen often is when a new generation of people come through, they don't know, and they assume there is no existing knowledge, and so they try and reinvent it. And so what we get is a slightly different perspective of what I call a knowledge half-life. And if you cycle through the decades, starting with programmed instruction in the 60s, computer-assisted learning in the 70s, hypermedia in the 80s, multimedia in the 90s, online learning in the 2000s, it's already 10 years ago or more, personal learning right about now, open learning coming, and I'm not sure what will be in the future, but what we have is what I see as these ongoing slopes of forgetfulness, is that we sort of forget about our past and we keep on trying to go with the new technology. And as a practitioner in the field and an observer, what I see is online learning or e-learning that really is nothing like it should be. And the question, and of course none of you as practitioners develop those materials, but so many other people do, and I don't know why. And I'm trying to find that question. So with that knowledge half-life, we can sort of get an e-learning continuum. And that continuum has on one side using technology to access information. In the middle we have the dastardly learning management systems. And on the right-hand side we have interactions and simulations. And what I'd like you to do in a very quick session, I've got two dates there, 1983 and 2013. Where would you put them? And I guess I've given you some hints already in terms of this continuum. So I'll just give you 5 seconds. This is how I see it. 1983 lives over here when we had the Force with us and we knew that simulation and interaction was the way to use technology as a tool. 2013 seems to be down here where e-learning seems to be good when people are very good at creating digital paper. It's quite staggering. But that's where we've gone, backwards. And rather than our focus being on learning with technology, our focus now seems to be on the technology and maybe some learning will happen. Now, that may be not true for each of you out there, but it is certainly true for me in terms of people that I see. And people, I can tell you, are in the university systems who do not know how to use online learning systems, even though they're told to do so. So that's an e-learning continuum, and that's a perspective of technology. And so my questions to you, again, bringing this one up, is technology the dark side, or is technology the force? Or can it be both? I guess is the question. So I'll leave that with you and move on. And I want to look briefly at what I've called some sacred cows. Now, if you don't know what a sacred cow is, I'll let you know. First of all, here's a picture of a sacred cow. And it's something that's considered immune from question or criticism. And what I've done is I've identified 8 things that I think often are immune from criticism. We think that they're the right things to do, but I'm going to challenge that they are the right things. And what I find is, depending on how we think about these, they will either be a force for you as an e-learning developer and an e-learning user, or they will be the dark side and they will really destroy what we do. So let's have a look at these. So first of all, I've got my friend Darth Vader up there and his little box of tricks. And let's see what comes out of this magic box, shall we? Okay, learning preferences, learning styles, multiple intelligences, cultures, generations. All of those are very topical. And one of the questions I get all the time is, okay, I've got a visual student. How do I, because I gave them a learning styles inventory, how do I design a course for a visual student? Or how do I design a class for an auditory student? If you ask those questions, you're asking the wrong questions. You cannot design for someone's learning styles. You cannot design for someone's intelligences. You cannot design for someone's culture. I challenge you to tell me how you do it, because you can't do it. But there is a way to do it, and if you come to my workshop or my talk afterwards, I'll tell you how. So we'll put that away. What comes next? Oh dear, learning management systems. Probably one of the worst things ever to come into e-learning. One of the worst things ever. Our friend Moodle. I still don't get it. It's supposed to be constructivist, and what do people do? They create lessons of digital paper. It's bizarre. I'm sure your courses aren't like that at all, but I can tell you the ones I've seen and others around the world are just staggering. So, they're a problem. Who's next? Oh, our friend the MOOC. And I know you're all doing a workshop yesterday on the MOOC, and because I've been around far too long, I'm now entering the age that I never thought I would, because my brother is older than me and he was into conspiracy theories. I'm now into conspiracy theories. So the MOOC to me is a wonderful thing, and we can get great benefit, but there's nothing magical about a MOOC. What is the design behind a MOOC? If you think about what's the design behind a MOOC, you can access some resources and you can talk to people. And I'll sure get shot down by the MOOC experts here, but it doesn't seem to be much more than that. However, what my conspiracy theory is, the reason that it's growing so quickly is because there's all these people who are going to eventually benefit out of it by marketing MOOCs. It's not about education, it's about marketing. And I suggest that when you look at technology, you have a very careful look about how much it's to do with marketing and how little it's to do with education. We'll put the MOOC to bed. Oh, another one, the flipped classroom. This is another trend that seems to have appeared recently, and it's like, oh, we have to flip our classrooms. And it's like, why? People have been doing it for centuries. Good teachers have been doing this type of practice for years. And yet we have this thing, the traditional and the flipped, and I guess I should have a flipped classroom because why? Well, surprise, surprise, all those companies who are providing videos that you can access at home are no doubt pushing the flipped classroom. It has nothing to do with education, ladies and gentlemen. It has to do with people making money. It's not about education, it's not about pedagogy, it's about technology and it's about money. So we'll put the flipped classroom away. Grading. Teachers, we love grading, don't we? Again, grading's really important if it's done properly, but we now seem to have a mania where everything the student does, every word they type, has to have a grade, has to have a point, has to be marked every day, every hour, every week. It's insane, and it's nonsense. Now, we can create really good assessment rubrics, and they're really important. The problem is, I wish there was someone out there who knew how to create an assessment rubric that was valid and reliable. because all the ones I see on the net that are supposed to be examples of good rubrics are rubbish. They're impossible to rate on, they're subjective, and they're just created very badly. So, aren't I lucky to be up here to have a rave? Credentials. A couple of things about credentials. And it's a very weird thing that we have organisations like the International Board for Standards in Training, Performance and Instruction, we have AECT, we have organisations like AACE and many others around the world that can tell you about credentials for designers or instructional designers. And yet what happens? We get ads like this that want people who can create in Captivate and YouTube. What's that got to do with education? There is this sense that an instructional designer is someone who can use PowerPoint. It's insane. It really is crazy. And yet we're all being sucked into this thing that learning is technology, learning is YouTube. Another thing about credentials and instructional designers, and it's to do with the term itself, is we also have this notion by Michael Allen and Kathy Moore and other people that instructional design is really boring and we need to do something interesting. And I just wanted to put up Kathy Moore's, this is a nice thing, this is the force, this is where the force is. Kathy Moore's action mapping, because it has nothing to do with boring design. What it has to do is with performance and action and students being engaged because they have a purpose. So there's our credentials, and let's put them way in the box. Interactivity. We all know that because we have a learning management system and because we're online, it must be interactive. Wrong. One of the things that we do have is research, and this comes from some work I did a number of years ago, but it's quite possible to create interactive systems where, if my mouse shows up, whereas along this horizontal path here, you can have a learner who is engaged with all types of interaction and in effect reaches a state, which if I can say his name correctly, which Csikszentmihalyi talks about flow. How many of your students are actually engaged in a sense of flow when they're in an online learning course? And how many of them are just struggling to find out what they're supposed to do? So there is a potential for us to do this, but the technology sometimes inhibits us. And last but not least, plagiarism. I have two rules for plagiarism that I tell my students. One, know what it is, and two, don't do it. And I don't have them use Turnitin, and I don't have them use other tools. Of course, plagiarism is very important, and I've done my best not to plagiarise things in this talk, because in the PowerPoint itself, they're all annotated. But one of the things that's very complex about plagiarism, and again, this is where the conspiracy theory comes in, it seems to me that plagiarism has come a big deal as the anti-plagiarism software tools have become a big deal. And it's like every university now has to buy one, and huge expense is being made on going anti-plagiarism instead of creating good learning experiences and good assessments which minimise the chance for plagiarism. I don't get it. But what we are getting, of course, as well, is the state school, abandon all dreams ye who enter here. And not only are we getting schools that are looking a bit like a penitentiary, we're getting the language of a penitentiary, where we have to have surveillance systems over students. And I'm trying to figure out what is going on when education has to put in systems that provide surveillance over students. It's like when I grew up after the Second World War, and what my father fought for was against the fascist regimes that were all about surveillance and arrest without trial and arrest without charge. Ladies and gentlemen, that's where our society is evolving, and that's where our schools are evolving, to the very things we fought against only 40 or 50 years ago. So, that's why I see some of these as a dark side. But there is some hope, and the hope is if we think a little differently, that we can use these things to our benefit and not against us and against our design. Many of you will have heard Sir Ken Robinson, and I was pleased that I worked out on PowerPoint how not to present you with 100 lines of text that I can read out to you. He said, "So in place of curiosity, what we have is a culture of compliance. Our children and teachers are encouraged to follow routine algorithms rather than to excite that power of imagination and curiosity. We all create our own lives through this restless process of imagining alternatives and possibilities, and what one of the roles of education is to waken and develop these powers of creativity. Instead, what we have is a culture of standardisation. There is wonderful work happening in this country and in all countries, but I have to say it's happening in spite of the dominant culture of education, not because of it. It's like people are sailing into a headwind all the time. And the reason I think is this, that many of the current policies are based on mechanistic conceptions of education. It's like education is an industrial process that can be improved just by having better data, and somewhere in, I think, the back of the minds of some policymakers is this idea that if we fine-tune it well enough, if we get it just right, it will all hum along perfectly into the future. It won't, and it never did. Whoops, sorry. It's wanting to play again. We won't play it again. But I just while it's coming out again, I think Ken Robinson's views of the world and his insights into what education and training can be are incredibly insightful and incredibly valuable. And especially when he talks about the educational system that in a sense is the dark side against the teachers who are the forces of light and have the force with them. So that's my sacred cows, and I hope maybe it's raised some questions. So as we move along this little journey, I want to talk about design. And design is my passion, it's what I write about, and it's what I do. I used to be a digital native, but now I'm apparently just a digital immigrant, so I design instead. So one of the questions, what is design? And having done a lot of research on this, if you want to take our colleague Dave Merrill's approach when he was in 1996, it was a great talk, when he basically, I think he almost had a stick and drew a line in the sand and said, we're standing against the shifting sands of new paradigms and realities. We've drawn a line, we boldly reclaim the technology of instructional design that built around the rock of instructional science. So is it enough for us to see instructional design as a science? The question that I ask is, if it's okay as a science, how come it's not working? So what's wrong with it? So we could go the other side and say, well, what about design as an art? Because there's certainly people who talk about design as an art. Let us get used to looking at the world through the eyes of others. Our task is to make a new kind of artist, a creator capable of understanding every kind of need. Because he knows how to approach human needs, we wish to make him conscious of his creative power, not scared of new facts. And so the question then, is design a science? Is design an art? Or is it something else? And I'll leave that open for you to have a look at. But I'll put this great image back up there just to remind you that we're talking about with design as whether it is a science or whether it is an art. And perhaps you've never thought about it being either one of those two things. But in talking about design, let me just flip through very quickly a couple of design models. And I've selected some from 3 different areas. There's the instructional design field that has a zillion models. All of them look pretty much like Dick and Carey's models, and very much represented on the ADDIE model. If we move forward a little bit, we've got understanding by design. Some of you may know it as backwards design by Wiggins and mctigue. And again, that's a waterfall model, and it's got a slightly different representation. If we move forward in a different design model is the constructive alignment framework by Jonathan Biggs. Again, that looks differently. This one's vertical rather than horizontal. It's also very much based around curriculum objectives or outcomes. And as you'll see later, it's also based around very much about alignment. So with those 3 models, one of the things I wanted to talk about is this concept of what's called morphic resonance, because I'm just going to flip back. We have all these concepts here, different models. They're all designed to enable one thing, student learning. And one of the nice things is this concept by Rupert Sheldrake of morphic resonance that some of you may know. And again, I can read it out. But the idea is that all humans draw upon collective memory to which all in turn contribute. It should be possible to observe the progressive establishment of new habits as they spread within the species. For example, when people learn something new, such as windsurfing, then as more people learn it, or learn to do it, it should trend to become progressively easier to learn just because so many others are doing it and have that skill. And one of the reasons, and that's perhaps a little bit unusual, a little different way of thinking, but what I've found is that as I progress through my career as a designer, what I'm finding is that my thoughts seem to be gelling very much with those of other people, even though I've never met them. And it's like, well, how does this happen? How do these thoughts come together? And it seems morphic resonance, which is playing again and again, seems to be one way to explain this, that as more people learn how to design and have a way of designing, then more and more people should design better, and that's what I'm hoping. But we'll move on and look at a design continuum. And this design continuum looks at those three areas. It looks at instructional design, it looks at universal or backwards design, and it looks at learning design. And I must say that I've had, for those of you that have heard me speak before, I'm often critical of instructional design practices, and one of the reasons for that is because of what I see as the result of instructional design. And again, going back to one of those sacred cows, probably the reason is not the problem with instructional design, it's because we're hiring instructional designers who don't know anything about instructional design, and that's a problem. However, when you look at instructional design and the theories, what you tend to have is instructional design is about designing something so teachers can use it. And I'm being very general here, so if there are specialists, I'll talk to you later about my generalisations. Universal and backwards design is more about teachers and learners, and learning design is much more about the learner. And one of the issues we face today, especially with e-learning, is that more and more students are now learning away from a campus. They're learning at home in their own environment, and therefore they don't have a teacher. So if you take the position that instructional design is for teachers, we don't need some of the principles of instructional design. We need to rethink what design is. And so I'm not going to make any arguments about where I live. I live over here in terms of my design practice and my design thinking. And part of that thinking means that as a designer, I'm thinking only about the learner. And in fact, the more I think about it, what I'm doing in terms of design is building teaching into the design, because one of my arguments is that, and George Siemens prompted this before, a number of years ago, is that perhaps we don't need teachers anymore. And I know that's contentious, but if we have good designs, what do we need? And I will try and answer that. But one of the things is that there are changing roles of teachers, and I had a very interesting discussion with Clark Quinn, some of you may know, last night, about the fact that in a classroom now, any of the participants can be teachers, any can be designers, and anybody can be learners. It's far more blurred than it used to be. But one of the things that also goes with is we need to have a philosophy of learning. And the question is, what is your philosophy of teaching and learning? Do you have one? And if not, why not? You need to have a philosophy of learning. And what goes along with that is an epistemology. Where do you think knowledge resides? If you think knowledge resides within you because you're a teacher, then I think you've got a big shock coming. Knowledge no longer resides in the individual, it resides in the net, and it resides in the collective force of the connections. So there's lots of things, and because of that, we have to rethink what our design practice is. I don't think it's any good to design for teachers. Of course, if you do have a traditional classroom where you have a teacher at the front of the class and the students sit there quietly, then yes, by all means, go ahead and design. But we can do much better than that. So, that says we're not going anywhere. Maybe there's another one. We're going to look at some design challenges. Based on what I've talked about this morning, there are some paradoxes that I'd like to raise. And the first one, and there's 6 of them, so they have to fit on the screen. I apologise for the size of the font. As I said in the beginning, technology should have caused a revolution in how we learn and how we teach. And yet education seems to be constraining rather than empowering. And the question is, why is this so? And you can see that there's sort of this light and dark side of these paradoxes. We have an extensive range of validated designer competencies for instructional designers or learning designers, yet in practice those competencies are not valued or even used. The technology that we have today promotes collaboration and connections and a pedagogy for social learning, but the educational systems are going through surveillance and generating fear that you'll actually be seen with somebody. We claim that online learning enables interactivity, and yet applications are more and more becoming non-interactive. Learning with technology allows us to have a range of roles, and yet both learners and teachers are sometimes just left as passive observers and onlookers. And finally, we have extensive knowledge about learning and teaching, and yet that knowledge, as I showed through the sacred cows, can often be a distractor to how we think rather than something which benefits how we think. So with those design paradoxes also come some design challenges, and there are three of these that I want to detail specifically. In terms of a designer, one of the things that we've got is an increasing number of people being hired to teach online classes who've got no teaching experience and no design experience, and yet they're being asked to design the class and they're being asked to teach the class. And I know David Merrill has a lot to say about that. So the question is, how do we cater for them? The second thing, we have an increasing number of online learners who are learning by themselves, away technically from other people, although of course they have connections, but not always connected to a teacher. And we continue to have increased performance demands on how people will actually do the job that they're supposed to be trained for. So in one of those challenges, and the way to respond to that is what I call design alchemy, and that's what I want to talk about now, is a concept that addresses those challenges, addresses the paradoxes, and what I would argue is also deals with those sacred cows in a particular way. So that's the one to talk about now. So basically, coming back to that diagram where I talked about the sort of art and science as being two aspects of design, for those of you, and I don't confess to know a lot about alchemy, but alchemy is in a way a combination of art and science. And so I feel very strongly that design and learning is about, using some of Ken Robertson's works, about imagination and innovation and curiosity and creativity. And they're not necessarily words that go with a scientific approach. And so it becomes very important for us to try and blend those two. And so the notion of design alchemy, which will be the title of a book coming out, also brings in the notion of the alchemist. And so the alchemist is someone who has magical powers of transmutation, and I think in many ways design is a thing of magic. And in that transmutation, as you know, if you know some of the popular history of alchemy, it's a transmutation of base metals into metals of greater value, so lead into gold. And when we apply that as a metaphor to education, what we're talking about is teachers, learners and designers transforming how they think, and especially designers focusing very much on transforming whatever they come across, whatever task they have to do, into something that is, in effect, golden. So we have golden learning experiences. And that's the role of the alchemist. And I believe there are ways that we can do that. So design alchemy itself is a fairly straightforward concept. And if you want to look at it and align it up, you can see that it fits quite nicely in terms of Dick and Carey's model. And the interesting thing with any design model is that we have to start somewhere and we have to finish somewhere. So it's not surprising these all look the same. But the design alchemy has three discrete components. It has a pedagogy underpinning it. It has a practice, a model for practice. And it has a set of assets. And I'll explain what they are. And they do align with other models. It's just my way of talking about it. So let's look first at the pedagogy. And the design alchemy pedagogy is based around 5 areas. Of course, there could be more, but these try and encapsulate some of my thinking. So the first thing is constructivism. So the learning theory about constructivism is the way that we construct, deconstruct and reconstruct our ideas, and that comes from the work of Dewey, Piaget and David Jonassen. So constructivism is an important aspect of the theory and the pedagogy underpinning design alchemy. The second one, from the work of Bandura and Vygotsky and others with social learning and social constructivism, is that we learn well, or part of learning is when we're with other people, and that's why we come to conferences, so we meet people and hear what others have to say, and why we like Facebook and Twitter and other social events so that we can connect with them. The pedagogy is also underpinned by situated cognition, which comes from Brown, Collins and Duguid, as well as Bill Clancy, and that is very much about that we learn based on things being contextualised, so that relates to authentic learning and situated learning and contextual learning. We have experiential learning that comes out of the work of Kolb and Fry, that we need to experience something to learn it. And lastly, connectivism, that has its origins well before George Siemens talked about it, but the idea that learning is part of a greater process and that learning can come through connections rather than just through an individual's endeavours. So that's the underpinning informing pedagogy behind design alchemy, and they come together into a learner-centred approach so that, and as I said before, the more that I work in education, the more that I see that I have to focus on the student, not the teacher. And so I have to think about all the things which are learner-centred, and I don't have time this morning to elaborate on all the elements that go together to be a learner-centred environment. I'm sure you're familiar with many of those. But with those learning theories feeding in, what comes out of the design alchemy pedagogy are, in fact, 7 different elements, except I kept them as 5 so to balance out the diagram. So the first 2 are that as a designer, what I have to make sure is that my learners are active and creative. So the students are active, well, participants, all the class participants or the course participants need to be active and creative. The second thing is that their learning needs to be social and it also needs to be inclusive. The third is that it needs to be contextual, so learning has to make sense to the student and has to be relevant in their own place. When you have students in a MOOC scattered around the world, they're not coming to learn something about where that MOOC is centred or where the host is. They're wanting to contextualise it within their own area, so that is a really critical element. They also need to focus on problem solving, working out things, so a learning needs to be very much focused on problem solving. And learning also needs to be emergent. And I'll talk a little bit more about emergence, but the principle about emergence is education is not about regurgitating old knowledge, it's about creating new knowledge. And that's the basis of emergence. So with that pedagogy, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the conditions of emergence because I find that one of the most interesting. And this is from a book by Johnson in 2001. And his work is very much based on originally looking at the work or looking at the research that had been done with populations of ants and slime moulds and things like that. And basically finding that it's the individual ants that together build the ant mound. They don't have a supervisor out there saying, you take that grain of sand over there and you take that sand over there. They just do it. And so the question is, why isn't education a bit more like that? What might education be like if there's far more reliance on the interaction between course participants and the knowledge they may generate? So in looking at this, the 5 conditions that Johnson talked about to enable emergence was that more is different, ignorance is useful, encourage random encounters, look for patterns in the signs, and pay attention to your neighbours. And I thought, oh, that was interesting because I had just been reading some work from 35 years before, which was Robert Gagne's Conditions of Learning, which many of you may be familiar with. And it just seemed an interesting juxtaposition, is that depending, and I remember I talked about philosophy. If you have a philosophy which is thinking about emergent learning, how you think about it is so much different from the traditions that we have grown up with. And it's not that the traditions are wrong, it's just that times change and we need to think differently. So I wanted to put them up there, and I didn't say in the beginning, but I will, for those of you that like PowerPoint slides, these will be on SharePoint somewhere. So if we come back to the design alchemy pedagogy, it's informed by learning theories, and it forms what I call the pedagogy of design alchemy. And to give an illustration of that, this is a template that I use with academic staff to help them design. And it needs a learning outcome and an assessment task. And we haven't talked about them yet, but unfortunately we need them now. So we might have a learning outcome, analyse the strengths and weaknesses of design models. We might have an assessment task, which is to complete part 1 of the design handbook. And then we have an activity. And this is a fairly standard activity. Taking account of gender, race and diversity, develop a substantiated argument that will present your case for the following issue. Instructional design is a science, not an art. Use examples from your own experience. Incorporate ideas generated from your fellow students. Use deliberations to create your reflections and present alternatives or challenges to the debate topic. And what I have is, I have on my right-hand side the scaffolding of the pedagogy. And so whenever I come to write an activity, what I do is, to the best of my ability, make sure that every activity is inclusive, active, problem-based, contextual, social, creative and emergent. And what I believe, and what it has shown in practice, is that when we have lots of designers by assignment who have to create learning activities, this will be a really neat tool for them to use, because it's founded on the learning theories that we all subscribe to, and it's a very easy pedagogy, and it's labelled really easily. And you don't have to get very complex. But there is a bit more than this. And I just wanted to put this in here because I like putting little flash bits in. One of the things about learning activities I encourage you to do is stop using discussion forums. Rule them out of anything you'd ever do. Stop using discussion forums. Now, notice that I didn't say stop using the discussion forum tool. I just said stop using discussion forums. And one of the things that happens is when you stop thinking about that, because you have a discussion or a forum tool, you have to have a discussion, you start changing your whole view of teaching and learning, certainly from people I've worked with. So instead, and I'm sure you all do this, but instead of having a discussion, have a role play, have a debate. Send students out to debate, to collect data and upload it. You can use a discussion tool to do that, it just doesn't have to be a discussion. So, try it, stop using discussions. The second part of design alchemy is the practice, and this is the neat part that I like the best, because I can work with an academic staff member, and in a matter of 2 hours I can design a complete course. Not the full details, not the full specifications, but I can have the whole course scoped out. And I've done it a number of times, so I'm confident enough to say it works. And one of the reasons for that is because I don't worry about subject matter or content. We don't have to worry about subject matter when we're designers. But the practice is a really neat practice. It starts off with the knowledge application, and you'll see that this is similar to other design practices. What do we want students to be able to do when they finish the course of study? That's the knowledge application. Many courses don't do that. The knowledge application, once you have that statement, will generate your learning outcomes. Your learning outcomes define your assessment items. Your assessment items define your learning activities. Your learning activities define and identify your learning resources. Learning resources are people, media, texts, anything that you need to use. And hey presto, I have a course design. And I can tell you it happens very quickly. In other words, you have a whole, as a designer, it's like I've sketched out what the whole, if I'm an architect, I know what the whole house looks like. And I haven't done the painting, I haven't done the electrics, and I haven't done the landscaping, but I know exactly what it's going to look like and which way it's facing. North facing, I think, is good, or is it south facing in this part of the world? But it also goes backwards, sort of like a confirmation or a validation. My learning resources inform my learning activities. My learning activities create my assessment items. My assessment items provide evidence of the learning outcomes. The learning outcomes confirm that I can apply the knowledge, and therefore I have evidence of understanding and perform. And one of the things that I have in here, or I don't have in here, is the word evaluation. And I do have a method of continuous improvement, but I don't have evaluation because this is self-evaluating. And the reason for that is, why would we develop a course that needs evaluating? Can't we design a course that has everything in it that's right? I mean, it's a sort of interesting question that we spend so much money evaluating courses when we have the knowledge and skills out there to design courses that don't need evaluating because we know how to design. It's like every new car that we buy, we have to evaluate it to see if it's going to drive from A to B. Most of them do. And the big word here with this is alignment. Things align. And I've done this, worked with academic staff, and they've gone, oh, the learning activities line up with the assessment items and line up with the outcomes. Oh, hello. So, the transformation that comes is this might look like a familiar course to you. It's in one of these 5-week courses. And on day 3 you do a discussion, day 4 a discussion, day 6 a quiz, day 7 an assignment, and you cover some topics and you read 7 chapters of the textbook in a week and you know everything. That's a typical type of course we get. What we need to do is we can transform that, and it's very simple, but you can transform it by defining the knowledge application, the outcome, the assessment, the activities and the resources. And I won't go through that because I'm going to be pulled off the stage in a moment. But I will be talking more about that this afternoon in the workshop, and also happy to talk about it this morning at 10 o'clock. So the last thing is the assets, and these, I guess, you will say, this is just the needs analysis. And I suppose it is, but I don't call it a needs analysis. These are assets. These are things that help me as a designer. And there are a whole lots of things, but the ones that I consider most important is, and even though I said technology is not necessarily a good thing, I need to know the technology. I need to know what technology I can use. But as I said before, the technology can change any time. I need to know what standards are out there, and there are institutional standards, there are national standards, and there are also professional standards that impact on design. I need to know about the programs I'm working with. I need to know about the research which is talking about the programs I'm working with. I need to have a process that will help me maintain continuous improvement and sustainability, and I'll give a very quick example about that. And I need to know the people that I'm working with, and there are people both within the institution and within my own networks. So those are assets. Very quickly, sustainability, when we look at the outcomes, the assessment and the activities and the interrelationship between those three, we have to see them as discrete, because how they work is they work by accessing a resource. But the sustainability, and again, people look at this idea and they go, oh, I didn't think about that, is that you don't change your activities or your assessment or your outcomes, but you do change your resources. So as the resources change, you can just change them. And the course is very sustainable. Now, what that means is you don't write a course syllabus with the textbook name, the edition, the date, and the page numbers the students have to read. And I just don't believe the argument, students need to be told where to go. This is rubbish. Students are quite capable of coming in and going and spending hours on the net finding stuff. Don't tell me they can't go to a textbook or some other resource and find the appropriate page to read if you tell them carefully enough in the design. So you can get rid of a whole lot of design effort, and I've worked with editors who say, oh, this would be great if every time there's a new textbook, we have to rewrite the whole study guide. I mean, this is nonsense. It's crazy. Okay, so that's design alchemy. Pedagogy, practice, and assets. And it's a combination, of art and science. So in today's journey, I've tried to take you through some definitions, some technology, some sacred cows, some design challenges, and lastly, design alchemy. And where we started is with e-learning. Is it the dark side or the force? And I guess we have so many challenges that we've got to face, and that we still have some things that I can see represent the dark side and some the force. However, if we want to go with the force, and that force is the pedagogy, not the technology. And that's just one little way you can look at them. And of course, if you go with the pedagogy and you go with the force, good old Luke Skywalker, then of course you go with design alchemy. Design alchemy is about transformation. It's about transforming your pedagogy from teacher-centred, content-based pedagogy to a learner-centred and outcomes-based pedagogy. It's about transforming learning. Learning is not about consuming and watching, it's about creating and imagining. And it's about transforming teaching. It's not the teacher as the sage, the master, the presenter or the guide. It's the teacher as the elder, the teacher as the apprentice, the teacher as the facilitator, and the teacher and the mentor. And so, having said that, I wish you every success. Go out and be a design alchemist and enjoy. Thank you very much.